Royal food tasters have been tasting the food of the rich and powerful, testing them for poison for thousands of years. Though the practice isn't foolproof, because if the person adding the poison is the food taster themselves, well, the whole system kind of breaks down. And that is exactly what happened with Claudius, the Roman emperor, who died after dining on his favorite dish of mushrooms. So thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring this video as I try not to poison myself on these ancient Roman honey-glazed mushrooms. This time on Tasting History. Being a royal food taster has to be one of the least desirable jobs in history. Yes, you do get to eat some of the best food that there is, but there is a possibility that you might die doing it. So it's no wonder that once in a while, the food tasters went rogue. And that seems to be what happened in 54 AD when Halotus, who is the first named food taster that I could find, probably poisoned his boss. So the Emperor Claudius had been ruling the Roman Empire for over 13 years. It had been a time of prosperity and expansion for the empire, but a time of continuous strife in Claudius's personal life, much of which had to do with Claudius's fourth wife, Agrippina the Younger. See, they both entered into the marriage already having children, and among others, Claudius had a son, Britannicus, and Agrippina had a son, Nero. You might have heard of him. Well, Claudius adopts Nero and takes him on as his own son and decides that after he dies, the two boys will rule the Roman Empire together, because that's going to work out. Well, for a while, things are going hunky-dory, but eventually the marriage between Claudius and Agrippina starts to kind of go on the skids, and Claudius is overheard complaining that he has really bad taste in wives. This is his fourth wife, and that maybe he regrets adopting Nero and that Britannicus should be the sole heir to the Roman Empire, so that the Roman people may at last have a genuine Caesar. Ouch. Well, Agrippina is not the kind of person to let her son be passed over, so she allegedly, and this is all alleged, she allegedly goes to a well-known poison maker named Locusta, and she gets this poison. And this is where the food taster Halotus comes into the story, because he is the one who supposedly does the deed. According to Tacitus, the poison was administered by the eunuch Halotus, whose regular duty was to bring in and taste the dishes. So notorious later were the whole proceedings that authors of the period have recorded that the poison was sprinkled on an exceptionally fine mushroom. But it seems that the poison didn't do what it was supposed to do, because Claudius got sick and threw up the poison. So Agrippina fell back on the complicity of the doctor Xenophon. He, it is believed, under cover of assisting the emperor's struggles to vomit, plunged a feather dipped in a quick poison down his throat. It's like in The Emperor's New Groove, where the poison to kill Cusco doesn't work, and so they have to hit him on the head. Now, the ancient authors kind of disagree on some of the details of the story. Some say that Halotus wasn't actually the one to administer the poison, but clearly he didn't do his job very well regardless. And did he get fired? No, he did not, because Nero, who then became emperor after they also poisoned Britannicus, a little pattern, he hired Halotus to be his royal food taster. So kind of makes me think maybe he was in on it. And even later, under Galba, who was the next emperor, Halotus gets a big old promotion to procurator. Talk about failing upwards. But the moral of the story is, if you fear that you're going to be poisoned, you better make sure that you really trust your royal food taster. Or you can do as I'm going to do and just make the food yourself. Now, since Claudius died eating mushrooms, I've decided to look through the ancient Roman text Apicius and find a recipe for another method for mushrooms. Place the chopped stalks in a clean pan, adding pepper, lovage, and a little honey. Mix with garum, add a little oil. Super simple and rather different than I feel mushrooms are typically prepared today. Now, most of these ancient Roman recipes call for the mushroom cap and stem to be served differently. They're prepared kind of differently. And if you want to just use the stems, that's fine, but I'm not going to be making another dish, so I would just throw away a bunch of mushroom caps, which seems wasteful. So I am going to use both. So for this recipe, what you'll need is 1/2 pound or 225 grams of small mushrooms. I am separating the stems and cutting the heads in half just so they cook evenly. 2 tablespoons of olive oil, 1 teaspoon of pepper. I'm using long pepper, which was beloved by the ancient Romans, and frankly, I think it's a little bit better than regular black pepper, so I'll put a link in the description to where you can get some of that, but you can use either one. 2 to 3 tablespoons of fresh lovage or celery leaves, chopped fine, 1 tablespoon of honey, and 1 tablespoon of garum. This is the ancient Roman fish sauce that I have actually made here on the channel before, and if you don't want to make it, and you probably shouldn't, I will put a link to where you can get some that is excellent in the description, but if you just want to use a fish sauce of any kind, that works. So first, whisk the honey and garum together in a small bowl, then whisk in the ground pepper. Then heat the oil in a heavy pan large enough that the mushrooms, when added, can sit in the pan in a single layer, and then saute the mushrooms over medium-high heat, coating them in the oil for 2 to 3 minutes, and then pour in the honey and garum mixture and coat the mushrooms in that. Sprinkle in the lovage leaves and reduce the heat to medium-low and let the mushrooms simmer until most of the liquid has evaporated and you're left with a lovely glaze. This should take 3 to 5 minutes. Before you do that, let me tell you a little bit more about the history of one of the worst jobs, royal food taster. Food tasters have been around since time immemorial because there seems to be something about being rich and powerful that makes you paranoid that people are trying to poison your food. And that paranoia actually might be rather well-founded, especially if you're kind of a jerk. Now, one of history's most famous paranoiacs was Mark Antony, the lover of Cleopatra. Now, often when we think of Antony and Cleopatra, we think of this wonderful love affair, but really, they did not have a healthy relationship at all. Neither of them trusted each other all that much, and Pliny the Elder wrote that Antonius held the queen in such extreme distrust as to be in dread of her very attentions even, and would not so much as touch his food unless another person had tasted it first. Well, for some reason, Cleopatra thought this was funny and decided to play a little practical joke on Antony by circumventing the food taster. So before this big banquet that they were going to have, she had a circlet of flowers made for her head, but she dipped each flower in poison. Well, the banquet begins and the food taster tests all of Mark Antony's food and his wine, and everything seems to be good, doesn't die. So things are going along, and partway through the banquet, everybody's a little tipsy, and Cleopatra says, "Hey, Mark Antony, I triple dog dare you to take one of my flowers and drink it in your wine. And if A Christmas Story has taught us anything, it is that you can't really turn down a triple dog dare." See, he'd been wary of the wine being poisoned, but it wasn't. And he didn't think that she would be crazy enough to wear poison flowers in her hair. But she was. And so she took one of these poisoned flowers and popped it in his wine. Then just as Antonius was on the very point of drinking, she arrested his arm with her hand. "Behold, Marcus Antonius," she said, "the woman against whom you are so careful to take these new precautions of yours in employing your tasters." Saying this, she ordered a man to be brought from prison and made him drink off the potion. He did so and fell dead upon the spot. In some versions of the story, it's actually the food taster who has to end up trying it, and he's the one that died. But regardless, very toxic relationship between these two. And I feel like the lesson to be learned here is if you're going to use a food taster, you gotta use them all the time. Maimonides, the 12th century physician for Saladin, wrote a treatise all about poisons and how to protect oneself, and he talks about how you're supposed to have someone taste the food that you think is poisoned. He actually says the person tasting it should be the person who has offered it to you. And he should not be satisfied with eating only a mouthful, as I have seen done by the cooks of kings in their presence. He also says you should take some personal responsibility and learn to identify foods that have been poisoned, or at least foods that you suspect of being poisoned. Basically, any foods that are sour, pungent, or highly flavored. Also, ill-smelling dishes or those prepared with onion or garlic. All these foods are best taken from a reliable person, above all suspicion, because the way to harm by poison is only to those foods which assimilate the poisonous taste and smell, as well as the poison's appearance and consistency. But even with these precautions, sometimes, on occasion, you might accidentally ingest some poison, at which point you need to do like Claudius did and try to throw it up. Maimonides says that the best thing to do is to induce vomiting and then have some milk or butter. Or, Best case scenario, you have a rooster around, because it is said that the excrements of roosters have a specific property to eliminate every poison by vomiting. Though I feel like that's just kind of swapping one poison with another, but what do I know? Now, poisoning has always been a popular way of getting rid of a rascally noble here and there, but by the late Middle Ages and the Renaissance, poisoning had become really in fashion. By the 15th century, anyone who was anyone had food tasters because, especially in places like Italy and the Papal States, poisoning had become quite common, or at least people thought that it had become common. Families like the Medici were famous for taking out their rivals with poison, a reputation which is probably not as real as people thought that it was. But the fact that people thought that they were poisoning everyone put everyone on edge. In the late 16th century, Gaspar de Guzman, the powerful Duke of Olivares, freaked out at a dinner in Valencia. When, having taken his first drink and tasting a very unnatural flavor in his wine, he feared poisoning and jumped away from the table in a great fury, asking for remedies. Meanwhile, the wine steward, having heard what was going on, reassured His Excellency that the bad taste resulted from his not having rinsed the wine flask well after washing it with vinegar and salt. When the steward then proceeded to drink the same wine, Olivares finally calmed down. So it wasn't poisoned, you just gave me a dirty cup to drink out of. You're still fired. Now, further north, in England, the clergy as well as the nobility were so paranoid of being poisoned that not only did they have their taste testers try their food and drink, but they had them kiss anything that might come in contact with their mouth while eating. In 1465, at a feast for an archbishop, it was written that then the carver taketh the napkin from his shoulder, and kisseth it for his assay, and delivereth to the Lord. Then take he the spoon, drieth it, and kisseth it for his assay. In the meantime the sewer goeth to the dresser, and there taketh assay of every dish, and doth give it to the steward and the cook to eat of all porridges, mustard, and other sauces. King Henry VIII took it a step further and had his servants kiss his sheets every night before he went to bed. And his daughter, Queen Elizabeth I, was also paranoid of being poisoned, and maybe for good reason, because it was suspected that the King of Spain was actually trying to hatch a plot to poison her. Supposedly, it was going to be done via her 70-year-old physician, Rodrigo Lopez, who had fled Spain from the Spanish Inquisition. There was really no evidence against him, and he had no reason to hurt the Queen, but there was a lot of hatred against him, partly because he was Jewish, and so he ended up being executed, even though everyone kind of knew that he wasn't guilty. And it was around this same time that a German traveler, Paul Hentzner, visited the court of Queen Elizabeth and later wrote down what he was seeing in regards to the royal food tasters. At length came a certain unmarried countess, accompanied by a noble matron bearing the food taster's knife. And when she had curtsied 3 times with the greatest of decorum, she then approached the table and wiped the plates with salt and bread. After she had remained for a while by the table, the royal bodyguards arrived, bringing in 24 courses in turn, on silver plates for the most part trimmed with gold. A certain nobleman received each course from them one at a time and placed them on the table. A lady food taster gave each bodyguard a mouthful to eat from the plate he bore, lest there be any suspicion of poison. Now you gotta realize that at this time, pretty much all of the poisons available took at least an hour to kick in, so they would often taste the food, then wait an hour before giving it to the Queen, so everything was gonna get served cold. Now the idea of royal food taster, or food taster in general, does seem rather antiquated, but it's not gone. Rather recently, there have been food tasters employed, especially by maniacal, evil leaders who are in fear of being poisoned. Adolf Hitler, for example. He had a team of food tasters, and Margot Volk, who was one of them, came out to tell her story. See, she and her family were not in good graces with the Nazi Party. Her father was actually taken away because he wouldn't join, and she refused to participate in the League of German Girls. Well, following some bombings in Berlin, she fled the city and ended up in a small town in Poland. And it happened to be that this small town was right near the Wolf's Lair, where Hitler set up his Eastern Front headquarters. I'd hardly arrived when the SS showed up at the door and demanded, "Come with us." At that point, she became one of 15 girls at the Wolf's Lair who tested Hitler's food for poison. The food was delicious, only the best vegetables, asparagus, bell peppers, everything you can imagine, and always with a side of rice or pasta. But this constant fear. We knew of all these poisoning rumors and could never enjoy the food. Every day we feared it was going to be our last meal. We cried a lot and hugged each other. We asked each other, will we still be alive tomorrow or not? The girls would eat the food and then wait an hour, and then if they hadn't died, the food would be taken to Hitler. Following a failed attempt on his life in 1944, not by poisoning, but by a suitcase bomb, the girls were rounded up, and rather than getting to live at home, they were basically put in captivity at the Wolf's Lair and kept under constant guard. And only when the Soviet army came through did Margot escape, but she was the only one to escape. All of the other food tasters died. Now, that Soviet army, of course, was under the control of Joseph Stalin, who also employed a food taster. Though instead of using someone he thought was expendable, he would only use someone who he absolutely trusted. Sasha Ignatashvili. Now, Sasha was friends with Stalin when they were boys, and many have actually claimed that they were even half-brothers. Though Stalin's true paternity is unknown, so it's impossible to know if they actually were. But regardless, they were very good friends, and he trusted Sasha, and so he put Sasha in charge of all of his big banquets and state dinners and basically any time that he was eating. And eventually, he even became his food taster, earning him the nickname the Rabbit. What I found fascinating is that since Sasha was in charge of these big banquets, he employed a number of cooks. And one of those cooks had cooked for a lot of famous Russians, not only Stalin, but also Vladimir Lenin and Grigory Rasputin. And that chef has a famous grandson. His grandson is Vladimir Putin, who also uses taste testers because he's paranoid of being poisoned. Now, I personally am not paranoid of being poisoned, so I don't need a food tester to taste these ancient Roman mushrooms. And here we are, honeyed mushrooms from ancient Rome. Now, I say I don't need a food taster, but I actually wouldn't turn one down because, spoiler alert, I don't actually care for mushrooms. It's not their flavor, it's a texture thing, like squeak when I bite into them. But we'll see how I like them today. Here we go. The flavor's really good. You know what this reminds me of? Honey glazed cashews or something like that, but then you get that earthiness of the mushroom. It's actually a really nice combination. And then a little spice from the pepper. That's a complicated dish. I actually like that. If I like mushrooms, I would love that on maybe a different vegetable or something like that. But if you like mushrooms, I bet you'd really, really like this. Especially because I feel like sweet and mushroom don't often go together today. But this is that combination of those two flavors, which is pretty cool. Also, I got to point out this tiny little spoon. I got it in England, and it is a replica of an ancient Roman spoon that they found in the old Roman town at Canterbury. And I just thought it was really cool. Jose says it makes me look like the hand of the king. Either way, tiny spoon. I bet most people have never heard of a cook named Mary Mallon, but it turns out she's actually one of the most famous people in American history. It's just that she's better known as Typhoid Mary. And today I'm going to be making a peach ice cream from 1911, the same dish which inadvertently allowed Mary to spread typhoid across New York City. So thank you to my Patreon patrons for supporting this channel as we make Typhoid Mary's peach ice cream, this time on Tasting History. Earlier this year, I did a video on the history of gout, and people really enjoyed it, so I figured I would do a whole little series of videos that have to do with food-related illnesses, spread out over the rest of the year. So this is number 2 in that series, a video on typhoid. Now, typhoid is still with us today in many parts of the world, but in North America and Europe, it was much more common in the 19th and early 20th century before hand washing became as common as it would become today. Back then, typhoid was endemic and caused millions of people to become seriously ill each year, and with a mortality rate of 10%, it was also one of the most deadly diseases around. It has a number of symptoms, but the most severe tend to be gastrointestinal in nature, and it's usually contracted by eating food or drinking water that has been contaminated with the Salmonella typhi bacteria. And so finding a source of that bacteria has always been the best way to stop an outbreak. And in the 19th and early 20th century, that usually meant finding somebody who had typhoid. But that wasn't the case with Typhoid Mary, because while she had it, she didn't have any symptoms, so nobody knew that she had it, and she turned out to be the first known asymptomatic carrier of typhoid. She unwittingly spread the disease as a cook to wealthy New York families, and years later, Dr. George Soper, who had discovered Typhoid Mary, wrote it was not first clear how the family could have been infected from the cook. There is little food that a cook handles which is not subsequently raised to a temperature sufficient to make it harmless. I found, however, that on a certain Sunday there was a dessert which Mary prepared, and of which everybody present was extremely fond. This was ice cream with fresh peaches cut up and frozen in it. I suppose no better way could be found for a cook to cleanse her hands of microbes and infect a family. Now this dish might have been any kind of ice cream, he's not specific. It could have been vanilla with peaches, which is very similar to a peach melba, which I've done here on the channel before and which is in the Tasting History cookbook, but it also could have been peach ice cream, and so that's what I'm going to be making. And I found numerous peach ice cream recipes from this period, but I wanted to make an American-style ice cream because she was cooking in America, and that means one with no egg yolks in it. Also, an American-style ice cream doesn't need to be cooked, so everything is raw, which is important for spreading typhoid. The recipe comes from the 1911 cookbook Everyday Desserts by Olive Green. And her name was not actually Olive Green, that was a pseudonym for Myrtle Reed. Peach ice cream. Mix a quart of cream with a cupful of sugar and 4 tablespoons of sherry. Add 4 cupfuls of peaches mashed fine and sweetened to taste, and freeze. Very simple, but it sounds delicious. So for this recipe, what you'll need is 8 to 10 ripe peaches, which should be enough to make about 4 cups of puree, plus a few more peaches to cut up and put into the ice cream. Then 1 quart or 1 liter of heavy cream, a quarter cup or 60 milliliters of sherry, and 1 cup or 200 grams of sugar, plus more for sweetening the peaches. And the amount of sugar that you'll need to sweeten the peaches is really going to depend on how ripe the peaches are. The riper the better, they will be sweeter, and the skin will come off a lot easier if they are ripe. And that is actually how you need to start the recipe after washing your hands so nobody gets typhoid. So the easiest way to peel a bunch of peaches is to slice the bottom with a little X, then bring a large pot of water to a boil and set the peaches in for about 15 or 20 seconds, and then take them out and immediately plunge them into ice water. Just a few seconds later, you should easily be able to peel the skin off using just your fingers. Once they're all peeled, slice them in half and remove the pit. Of course, if they are nice and ripe, you're probably going to mangle the peach as you remove the pit, but since we're making this into a puree, it really doesn't matter. And I'd start with 7 or 8 of the peaches, which should be enough for about 4 cups of puree, and then you can save the other peaches for cutting up and freezing in the ice cream. And you can use a potato masher to mash the peaches, but much easier is to actually use an immersion blender if you have one, because you want this to be as smooth as possible. Then measure out 4 cups of the puree, and at this point in the recipe it says it should be sweetened to taste. So exactly how sweet that is up to you. If they're really sweet, you might not even need anything at all. Mine were fairly sweet, and I started off with about a half cup, but then I ended up going with about a whole cup, and that was sweet enough for me. Once the puree is ready to go, grab a large bowl and add in the cream as well as the sherry, and then slowly add in the cup of sugar, whisking as you do. Some of the old recipes that I found actually have you make the sugar into a syrup, which will incorporate better, but this one says to just add the sugar, so that's what I'm doing. Then once the sugar is fully incorporated, you can add the sweetened peach puree in and stir it until everything is fully combined. Then it is time to freeze the ice cream, and for this, you will need an ice cream maker. I am using a very simple Cuisinart ice cream maker. It's not that expensive and it's very effective, but they also make really fancy ones that can usually do a lot more ice cream at one time. Whatever you use, add the mixture to the maker and follow the instructions to turn it into a soft serve ice cream. And while it works, find a mold of some sort to freeze the ice cream. Ice cream was pretty much always molded at this time, often in the shape of the main ingredient, but for this you can use any mold, even if it's just a glass or metal bowl. So slice up one of the peaches and put a few slices in the mold, and then when the ice cream is ready, pour it into the mold. And you can add more peaches throughout so they'll get frozen inside. Then fill the mold to the top with the ice cream and set it in the freezer for several hours until it is nice and firm. And during that time, make sure you are subscribed to Tasting History. Hit that like button. It really does help out the channel as I tell you the tragic tale of Typhoid Mary. On August 27, 1906, the daughter of Charles Henry Warren, a banker to the elite of New York City, became horribly ill with typhoid. The family was in Oyster Bay on Long Island where they'd rented a mansion for the summer. The area was filled with wealthy New Yorkers who spent their summers there to escape the heat of the city. So with this type of society, it was unusual that Mr. Warren's daughter should become ill with typhoid, which was a disease usually associated with poverty and filth. Even more worrying was that by the end of the week, Mrs. Warren, along with a second daughter, 2 maids, and a gardener, had all become ill with the disease. While this was obviously distressing for the family, who was ill, it was also distressing to the owner of the home, Mr. George Thompson. He actually owned several houses in the area and would rent them out, kind of an early adopter of the Airbnb model. But if word got out that his houses had typhoid, he was worried nobody would want to rent them. So before word spread, Thompson had some doctors from the area come in to test the waters of the water supply, the well, the cesspit, the outhouse, the one working toilet inside, but they all came up clean as a cesspit and a toilet can be. That is, they didn't have typhoid. Finally, Thompson contacted friends in New York who put him in touch with Dr. George Soper, who, despite his title, was not a medical doctor, but a sanitary engineer. Soper decided to focus on the people who were actually in the house, both the family and the people who were working there. But other than those who had already come down with typhoid, nobody else seemed to have any sign of the illness. But there was one person who during the time of the outbreak was there and then 3 weeks into it left. And she didn't leave a forwarding address and she left with no notice at all. She was a cook named Mary Mallon. Mary Mallon was born September 23, 1869 in County Tyrone in the north of Ireland. And when she was about 15, she emigrated to the US and after living with her aunt and uncle, worked as a maid and then a cook in the homes of New York's affluent families. Between 1900 and 1906, she had worked for at least 7 families, the last being the Warrens in Oyster Bay. And Dr. Soper was the first one who reached out to contact all of these families, and it turns out that all but one had had an outbreak of typhoid shortly after Mary started working for them. In all, 22 people had become ill and 1 young girl had died. And so Soper was the first to kind of put all of these dots together and came to the conclusion that it was Mary Mallon who was causing all of these outbreaks. The problem was he didn't know where she was. It wasn't until the following year, in March of 1907, that he became aware of a report out of Manhattan, where a wealthy family living on Park Avenue was being ravaged with typhoid, leading to the death of a young woman in her 20s. And after some investigation, he learned that their cook was Mary Mallon, the current cook. And so he went to the house and went to the kitchen to confront Mallon, and when he was there, with all of her co-workers around, he said, "Have you noticed that everywhere you go, people get typhoid?" And she had. She admitted, yes, absolutely. But just thank goodness I've never gotten it. How lucky am I? And that's when he broke it to her that actually you probably did get it. It was just such a mild case that you never realized it. And then, in front of all of her colleagues, in his own words, "I was as diplomatic as possible, but I had to say I suspected her of making people sick, and that I wanted specimens of her urine, feces, and blood. She seized a carving fork and advanced in my direction. I pressed rapidly down the long narrow hall, through the tall iron gate, out through the area, and so to the sidewalk. I felt rather lucky to escape. I confessed to myself that I had made a bad start. Apparently, Mary did not understand that I wanted to help her. Apparently not. Now, it is unclear whether Mary had any inkling at this time that she actually was the cause of all of these outbreaks. She obviously knew that they were happening, and she did leave shortly after they took place, but possibly just as a way to preserve her own health. Also, nobody in the medical community knew of an asymptomatic carrier of typhoid at this point, so why would she possibly think that she was the first? Well, Dr. Soper, after recovering his wits from the attempted forking that Mary tried to give him, decided that it was best to follow her and find out where she lived, and so he did. He kind of stalked her, not gonna lie, and then hounded her for a while, but he was unable to convince her that she was, in his own words, a living human culture tube and chronic typhoid germ producer, a menace to the community. So much for bedside manner, right? Well, Dr. Soper decided finally to contact the authorities, specifically the New York City Health Department, and tried to convince them that he might have found the first known asymptomatic typhoid carrier. And finally, they agreed. The department acted favorably on my recommendation. It would get the specimens peacefully, if possible. But if this was not possible, it would get them anyway. First, the department sent a female doctor, Dr. Josephine Baker, a rarity at the time, but they thought that a female doctor might have better luck at getting Mary to give up some specimen samples, but she did not have better luck. Mary just slammed the door in her face. So then Dr. Baker went back, this time with some policemen in tow, but Mary was a sly one and escaped out of the kitchen, leading the men on a 3-hour foot chase around Manhattan. This 40-year-old woman was seen leaping out of windows and over fences, and finally she barricaded herself in a privy, though likely had somebody helping her to put trash cans in front of it. And there, the police finally caught up with her and took her into custody, but still, Mary did not go quietly. As Dr. Baker described it, springing from her lair, fighting and cursing, both of which she could do with appalling efficiency and vigor, I told the policeman to pick her up and put her in the ambulance. This we did, and the ride down to the hospital was quite a wild one. At this point, Mary was taken to a hospital where they took samples, and it turns out Mary was just chock full of typhoid. At that, she was sent into quarantine on North Brother Island in the East River off the Bronx. Thus, Typhoid Mary, Mary Mallon, though 40, fat, buxom, a typical cook, has been a prisoner because of the fear of the doctors that she will spread the dread typhus germ wherever she lives. For 3 years, Mary was kept against her will on the island, and during that time, they never really explained to her why they thought that she was a carrier, why she had been spreading this disease. And even the doctors didn't seem to fully understand the situation because they didn't force her to wash her hands while she cooked for them. Yes, while she was on the island, she was one of the cooks for the nurses and the doctors. So that being the case, it's no wonder that Mary and many others believed that she was actually just being used as a scapegoat because she was an Irish immigrant. At this time, there was so much fear and hatred against the Irish that they were often used as scapegoats for all sorts of things simply because they were Irish immigrants and they had an accent. She said, "All the water in the ocean wouldn't clear me from this charge in the eyes of the health department. They want to make a showing. They want to get credit for protecting the rich, and I am the victim." But while some of the public did sympathize with her, many were also frightened of her, partly because of an article that Dr. Soper put out labeling her Typhoid Mary, a name which was picked up by newspapers and other doctors alike. In a letter to her lawyer, Mary wrote, "I have been in fact a peep show for everybody. Even the interns had to come to see me and ask about the facts already known to the whole wide world. The tuberculosis men would say, 'There she is, the kidnapped woman.' Dr. Park has even had me illustrated in Chicago. I wonder how the said Dr. William H. Park would like to be insulted and put in the journal and call him or his wife Typhoid William Park." Though even as the name by which history would remember her spread, so too did her reputation for being quite the cook. In 1909, the Topeka State Journal reported that he wants to marry her, Out in Lansing, Michigan, there is a man anxious to marry Typhoid Mary. The man does not seem to doubt that Mary will have him. He never met the woman, who is said to be a living culture of typhoid fever bacilli, but all he read in the paper, he is assured she must be a good cook. He sets down as the first requisite of a good wife her ability to cook. Eventually, in 1910, after 3 years of being quarantined, Mary was released on the promise that she would never be a cook again. Unfortunately, that is not the end of our story, because after some months of trying to be a laundress and then trying to let out a room, Mary found that she just couldn't make ends meet, so she had to go back to her old profession of being a cook. Of course, no agency was going to place her with a wealthy family anymore, so she had to do something else. And Dr. Soper reported that she violated every detail of the pledge she had given to the Department of Health. She changed her name and went to cooking again. Under the name of Marie Bresshoff and sometimes Mrs. Brown, she now cooked in hotels, restaurants, and sanatoria. Over the next 5 years, everywhere that Mary went, typhoid was sure to go. Outbreak after outbreak after outbreak, everywhere that she worked. And I understand not wanting to admit that you're the one making all of these people sick, but at some point I feel like she had to have realized that what the doctors were saying was true. She was the source of the bacteria. Then in 1915, when she was working at Sloan Hospital for Women in Manhattan, there was an outbreak that infected 25 people, 2 of whom died. And to discover the cause, the chief obstetrician reached out to someone with a proven track record, Dr. George Soper. After a description of everyone who worked there, including the cooks, he obtained a writing sample from the cook and confirmed that is Mary Mallon, only under a different name. So she was confronted, she fled to Long Island, but there the police caught up with her, and she was once again taken into custody and sent back to North Brother Island, this time for the remainder of her life. For 23 years, she lived on the island in a cottage, and for work, she would wash bottles in the laboratory. And occasionally she was allowed to visit the mainland for the day, because unless she was cooking, she wasn't really a danger to anyone, but she would always have to come back to the island by nightfall. Mary had lost all of the fight that she had in her first quarantine, and by all accounts had become resigned to her fate. And Dr. Soper, the man who had somewhat cruelly dubbed her Typhoid Mary, wrote that she felt that she had been hounded because of typhoid fever. She did not admit that there was any typhoid about her, but since others said there was, she had not been allowed to go freely where she pleased and do what she wanted to do. As her lawyer had said, she had been advertised to the world as a dangerous person and had been treated worse than a criminal, and yet she had not been guilty of the least violence toward anybody. On Christmas morning 1932, she was found on the ground in her cottage, paralyzed from a stroke, and 6 years later, in November of 1938, she died, and only 9 people came to her funeral. By that time, Mary Mallon was all but forgotten, but Typhoid Mary is remembered to this day. Honestly, even for all her obstinance, it's really hard not to pity Mary Mallon. During her lifetime, other asymptomatic carriers of typhoid were identified, and none of them were put away forever. They were allowed to live their lives. Now, it was the fact that she went back to cook that was the issue at hand, and so, she couldn't be trusted not to do that. But also, it's hard to imagine what she actually believed way back then, when the idea of germs and how it all worked and how disease was spread was still unknown by most of the public. This was a time before hand washing was very common, even when you were a cook. Fortunately, we live in a time where it's very well known and documented, and so we do wash our hands, especially before we cook, so we don't have to worry about passing on typhoid with dishes like this peach ice cream. So once the ice cream has frozen, you can release it from the mold by simply letting it warm a bit by sitting out for a few minutes, or you can rush it a little by putting a hot towel over the top for a moment. Then you can add more peaches for decoration, and should you have any of the peach puree left, you can sweeten it and strain it through a strainer and use that as a puree atop the ice cream. And here we are, Typhoid Mary's peach ice cream from 1911. I gotta say, it looks absolutely fantastic. I'm not gonna lie, I was taking tastes even before I froze it, and so I know it's gonna taste good. So often they would basically slice this, kind of more like an ice cream cake of sorts, but I'm just gonna dig into it since it's only me here. Okay, it's very hard. I'm gonna just start with a little bit of the ice cream. It does have some of the puree on top. The peach flavor is so strong. It's absolutely wonderful. You can tell it's not artificial at all. It is really just peach forward, but then you do get a little of like that, what is this, kind of from the sherry. It is so mild that it is almost hard to place what it is if I didn't know that it was sherry, but that's what it is. It doesn't taste alcoholic, it just kind of lends that, that flavor. I'm gonna try a bit of the actual peach that was frozen in it, and it is that peach that seems to have been the culprit. It was the raw peach. So let me try that. Very cold. Okay, so not gonna lie, the actual peach that is frozen inside is so cold. It doesn't have any flavor. It's not that it doesn't have flavor, it's that it like has numbed the inside of my mouth, so I couldn't really taste it. I think if I let it cool a little or warm a little bit, it'll be better, but I understand, I think that having the peaches on the outside, not frozen, would be better, but he did say that they are frozen in it, and I did find recipes for peaches specifically, but other fruits as well, being frozen inside. So it was a thing, and I guess even today they freeze pieces of fruit. It's really, really cold. But just the ice cream, I think that's the way to go. So if you want to know more about Typhoid Mary, one of the best books on the subject was actually written by Anthony Bourdain, who I absolutely love, and I didn't know that he did any historical food writing, but it's really, really good, and he's a wonderfully entertaining author, so I wish that he had been able to do more of that, but it's definitely worth a read. So I'll have more food-centric, malady-themed videos coming in the future. I have a whole list of ones that I want to make. You should make this. It's actually really easy as long as you have an ice cream maker and as long as peaches are in season. There are other recipes that use canned peaches, but this one does call for fresh, and it's delicious. Perfect for summer. So I will see you next time on Tasting History. Hey, 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 it's Fat Tuesday, Mardi Gras, and that means your last chance to gorge yourself before 40 days of Lenten fasting. If you do Lent. If not, then it's just Tuesday. But in Sweden, it's a day to glut your gut on semlor, or Hedvig. But a word of warning, these delectable buns can be quite dangerous. In fact, they once killed a king of Sweden. Semlor, this time on Tasting History. So this dish was brought to my attention from one of my Patreon patrons, Tova, and she actually did a lot to help with this episode because she did all the translating, helped me with pronunciations, and did a lot of the research because a lot of the stuff was in Swedish and I couldn't even find it. Also, thank you to today's sponsor, the city of Lindsborg, Kansas, but more on that later. So these semlor, or semla, which is the singular, are also known as fjättestagsbulla, which means Fat Tuesday bun. And typically today they are served with whipped cream and an almond filling, or sometimes a custard. But in the 18th century, they were often served in a dish of warm milk. And still today they can be done in the same way, but not exactly the same way that our recipe calls for. Today's recipe is from 1755 and is called Hedvig med mandel, or hot wall with almonds. It comes from the Hjälprede i hushållningen för unga fruntimmer, or Guide to Housekeeping for Young Women by Kajsa Varg. Hedvig med mandel. Take small round wheat bread buns and slice a round plate from the top. Then dig out all the insides and put it in a bowl. Soak it with sweet cream or milk and mix it well with a spoon. Take an egg for each bun and mix it into the wet bread. Add to it peeled and fairly finely crushed almonds, sugar, 2 tablespoons of melted butter for each bun, and a little salt. Stir this well together and put on a fire pot so that nothing solidifies. Then fill the empty buns and lay the round plate on top. Tie well around with a thick string so that the plate remains in place, and put the buns in a wide pot so that they can stand next to each other. Then pour milk in the same pot, but not so much that it submerges them, and then let it boil for half an hour. In another container, boil a stoup of sweet milk or more, depending on the quantity of the bread, and put in it a little sugar and butter. When it is to be served, the string is removed and the buns are placed in a deep dish. The boiled milk is thickened with 2 egg yolks, then a little milk is poured on the buns and the rest is poured into the bowl to carry in when eaten. So the recipe just calls for wheat buns, which leaves it open to interpretation. So I'm going to be making a modified version of the Sally Lunn bun that I made last spring. It comes from the same time period, so I figured it will work. The difference is going to be, instead of adding saffron to the bun, I'm going to add a little bit of cardamom because that's the traditional way of making the bread today. So for the dough, what you'll need is 4 cups or 480 grams of bread flour, 1 packet or 7 grams of dry yeast, 1 1/4 cup or 280 milliliters of whole milk, 6 tablespoons or 85 grams of softened butter, 1/4 cup or 50 grams of sugar, 2 eggs, 1 1/2 teaspoons of salt, and 1 teaspoon of cardamom. So before we actually get to making this bread, I need to tell you about the weirdest coincidence that happened to me. So I was writing this episode, like actually typing out the words, and an email pops up from Little Sweden. Little Sweden. Turns out there is a town in Kansas called Lindsborg, which is known as Little Sweden. It was founded by Swedish immigrants, and still to this day they celebrate a lot of Swedish festivals. Midsummer, St. Lucia's Day, and the highlight of the year, Svensk Hyllningsfest. So when I told them that I was doing an episode on semlor, they asked to sponsor the video, and I said okay. So thank you to the city of Lindsborg, Kansas, and I will put a link to all of the festival details down in the description. But until I can get to either Sweden or Lindsborg, Kansas, the only way to get my Swedish fix, Swedish fix, try saying that 5 times fast, is with today's semlor. So first, warm your milk to around 100 degrees Fahrenheit or 38 degrees Celsius and dissolve the sugar into it. Then take the flour and add the salt, the yeast, the cardamom, and whisk that together. Then pour the milk solution into the flour and work everything together into a ragged dough. Then add the eggs and the softened butter and work to combine. Now you can absolutely do this with your hands, but it is a really sticky dough, so if you have like a KitchenAid stand mixer, now is the time to use it. Knead the dough until it becomes nice and smooth, though it will still be quite sticky. Then cover the dough with a tea towel and let it rise for about an hour or 90 minutes or until it's doubled in size. Once the dough is well risen, punch out the air and divide it into 8 to 12 pieces. Really depends on the size of semlor that you're going for. I went big, so I went with 8. Then shape them into buns by stretching the dough out and folding it back in on itself until you have a circle. Then flip it over and roll it into a ball. Set the dough onto lined baking sheets. These will expand quite a bit, so to stop them from running into each other, which I failed at, keep them pretty far apart. Also, I would recommend either putting down some parchment paper or the saving grace of bakers everywhere, some Silpat. Link in the description. Then cover your buns and let them rise another 45 minutes. That was my best Mae West, by the way. While they're rising, set the oven to 400 degrees Fahrenheit or 200 degrees Celsius. Now this part is merely aesthetic, so not necessary, but if you want your buns to shine like the top of the Chrysler building, just give them a nice little egg wash before you put them into the oven. Then bake them for 15 minutes. Once they're done, take them out of the oven and set them on a wire rack to cool completely, and they do have to be cool before we can make our filling. Once they are cool, the recipe calls for us to cut the top off and dig out the insides. Now for the filling, besides the inside of the buns, what you'll need is 1 cup or 235 milliliters of cream, 8 medium eggs or 6 large eggs, beaten, 2 cups or 260 grams of almonds, ground. Now the Swedish word in the recipe implies that these are done with a mortar and pestle, so it shouldn't be as fine as almond flour. So you can hand grind this with a mortar and pestle, or you can just use a food processor for like 5 or 6 seconds. A half cup or 100 grams of sugar, 16 tablespoons or 226 grams of melted butter, and a teaspoon of salt. So first put the bread in a large pot, then pour the cream onto it and soak it well. Then add the beaten eggs, the ground almonds, the sugar, the melted butter, and the salt and mix everything together. Then set it over a low heat and stir. You want to make sure that the egg is pretty cooked, so about 5 minutes is what you want to do, but make sure to keep stirring it or else it will burn very quickly. Once it's cooked, fill the buns with the filling, and then put the little hat back on. Then the recipe says to tie the top onto the bun, and I found that it was necessary simply because getting the bun out without that tie becomes a mess. Then set the buns into a large pot. Also, it's best to actually set them onto like a little trivet at the bottom of the pot so they don't touch the pot, else they'll burn. But it's hard to get too many in if you do that, so I was only able to do 2 at a time. Took me a while, but worth it, so they weren't burned. Then pour in some milk. It should come about halfway up the buns. Then boil the milk for 30 minutes. Now while those buns are boiling, I'm going to pop a bottle of champagne and pour myself a glass, which will make more sense when we talk about our history, which we should do right now. Cheers. Adolf Friedrich was the Prince Bishop of Lübeck in modern-day Germany. In 1739, his cousin Karl Friedrich died, and so Adolf administered his lands because Karl's son was too young to do it himself. And that son was also named Karl Peter Ulrich, and he was invited to Russia by his aunt, the Empress Elizabeth. And this little boy would grow up to be Tsar Peter III of Russia, who, if you've ever watched the show The Great, about Catherine the Great, Catherine's husband is this kid, Tsar Peter, but all grown up. Huzzah! It's a great show. They take a lot of liberties historically, but it's still worth watching and is quite a hoot. What else I find a hoot is that both Karl, or Peter, and Catherine the Great were both German-speaking natives who then moved to Russia to rule the country while speaking French because that was the language of the court. Kind of confusing. And this importing of foreign monarchs was actually not that uncommon. In the 18th century, as it happened, a lot of monarchs ended up coming from what's now Germany. Russia did it with Peter III and Catherine the Great, England did it with George I, and Sweden did it with our dear Adolf Friedrich. And he was dear. He was supposedly a wonderful father and a great husband and really kind to his servants, which was not that common at the time. So hats off to him, which, speaking of, the hats were the ones that put him in power. In 1743, he was elected heir to the throne of Sweden by the Hat faction, or Hattarna, named after the little tri-corner hats that they used to wear, which I really want one of those. There was also another faction in Sweden at the time called the Caps, or Mössorna, the hats and the caps, like the Sharks and the Jets, or the Ukes and the Zooks from the Butter Battle Book by Dr. Seuss. Unfortunately, other than being a nice guy, Adolf Friedrich is not really remembered for much during his rule, because he was lucky enough to rule during a time of relative peace. And when there was governing to do, it was actually carried out by the Riksdag of the Estates, which was like a parliament. And honestly, he was fine with that, because he had hobbies. He made snuff boxes and loved to eat. But his wife, Queen Louisa Ulrika, was not so easily entertained, and basically the moment that she got on the throne, she started planning a coup d'etat against the Riksdag. And the history of it reads like a frickin' novel with every overused trope that you could possibly think of. First, she funds the coup by pawning the crown jewels. But she's ratted out by a scheming lady-in-waiting who tells the Riksdag that the jewels are gone. But nothing can be proven because the queen refuses to let anyone do an inventory of the jewels. But with all eyes watching, the plan has to change. So she brings in some new people into the plot, including her husband the king's illegitimate and ne'er-do-well nephew named Ernst. But just before the plan goes into action, Ernst gets drunk at a bar and spills the beans. I mean, the writing could not be worse. So he's arrested, interrogated, and of course, sings like a canary. Plan falls apart, and most of the leaders, not the queen, are decapitated, including Ernst. Just goes to show it never pays to snitch. If you just followed the plan, Ernst, you'd still have your head. But now the government is really watching the queen very closely, and by extension, the king, who doesn't seem to have had any idea what was going on. But it's no wonder that for the rest of his reign, he pretty much just kept to his snuff boxes. And honestly, that was a good thing, because under Adolf Friedrich, Sweden flourished. Besides being a time of unprecedented peace for the country, it was also the height of a period called the Age of Liberty, which saw civil rights really grow and a freedom of the press that was enjoyed by few other countries in Europe at the time. And that is what Adolf Friedrich should be remembered for. But it's not. because poor old Adolf Friedrich died in a humiliating way, and that is what we remember him for. See, having nothing to do as king, it gave Adolf a lot of time to pursue other interests, like eating. And eat he did. He was known for having quite the king-sized appetite to match his royal status. And on Shrove Tuesday, or Fat Tuesday, in 1771, he dined on lobster, caviar, sauerkraut, and kippers. And then he washed that all down with some champagne. Told you it'd be relevant. Then, with a hankering for his favorite dessert, he indulged in some hetväg, or semlor, in warm milk. 14 servings of it. The man could eat. On February 12, 1771, His Majesty felt quite well most of the day. He had eaten a fine dinner with a good appetite. After the meal, His Majesty was cheerful, happy, and content. But at about 8 o'clock in the evening, His Majesty was attacked rather hastily by a violent stomach cramp. His Majesty sat down on the nearest chair by the door. The color of his face changed, and then at once gave up his precious spirit. The King of Sweden died from eating too much dessert. And lobster and caviar and champagne, but the semlor always gets the credit. The royal doctor Hermann Krantz wrote about the king's stomach being packed solid with food, some of it not even being fully chewed. Then he goes into excruciating detail about the autopsy, which I will not share, except for the fact that during the embalming, the king had nutmegs put under his eyelids to keep their shape. Now, as sad as dying from acute indigestion is, the country really mourned because of who succeeded him. His son, Gustav III, took after his mother and was absolutely horrible. He accomplished that coup that his mother had failed at and then got rid of most of those pesky human rights and curtailed freedom of the press and led Sweden into a war with Russia before finally being assassinated. So the moral of this story is no matter how good these semlor are, do not eat 14 of them, or else your country might fall into ruin and you'll end up buried with nutmegs for eyes. Oddly enough, I'm still really looking forward to them. So as our buns finish boiling, let us make the sweet milk that they're served in. What you'll need is 4.5 cups or 1.3 liters of whole milk. The recipe calls for a stoop of milk, and that is a very old and archaic form of measurement, equaling about 1.3 liters. A half cup or 100 grams of sugar, 4 tablespoons or 56 grams of butter, and 2 egg yolks. Add the milk to a medium pot and bring to a boil. Then add in the sugar and butter and whisk them in. Then finally whisk in the 2 egg yolks. Simmer it for a couple more minutes so it will thicken just a bit. It's not going to become like a custard, but it will become thicker than milk. Then once your buns are done, remove them very gently from the pot, remove the string, and pour a bit of that thickened milk on top and around the semla. So I made several of these hetväg in the 18th century style, but then I also made some in a more modern style where it's not boiled, so it won't be soggy bread. You just add a little bit of whipped cream on them and maybe some powdered sugar for a flair. But before I try that modern version, I've poured myself another glass of pink champagne to enjoy with the 18th century version, just like King Adolf Friedrich did oh so many years ago. And here we are, hetväg med mandel. I'm so glad that I found such an ornate dish. I figured, it's for a king, so I needed something ornate. It's actually plastic. I got them on Amazon for like $5, but it looks fancy, and if I hadn't told you, you'd still probably know. But let's give this a shot. It's way too big a bite. Okay, it's still a big bite, but I don't care. That's amazing. Yeah, I could eat 14 of those. His were probably smaller. I could eat 7 of these. I'm not going to, but I totally could. Is it soggy? Yes, but it doesn't matter. That's so good. And I love that the filling is not super smooth. It is smooth, but there's still chunks because we ground it by hand. There are still pieces of almond that are just, "Ah, sweet mystery of life, at last I found thee, and thy name is semlor," because, amazing. Let's try the modern version. Now, I don't know the traditional way of eating these, so I'm just gonna bite into it and probably make a mess on camera. They're both awesome. I like the cream. I do like the whipped cream. It's a little bit more like a pastry because it's not soggy. But they're both fantastic. Make them. Make both. Do it. I cannot recommend it any more than I already have. There it is. Also, if you do make these, and I think you should, please share a picture either on our Reddit or on Instagram, because that's my favorite thing to do, is look at other people making the food that I made here on the channel. And I will see you next time on Tasting History. With Halloween just around the corner, it's a good time to make sure that you are prepared to fend off anything that might go bump in the night. And for vampires, that means loads of garlic. So I'll be making a 16th century Transylvanian recipe for beef with garlic harvester sauce. So today's recipe comes from 1580 and was written by the master chef at the court of the Prince of Transylvania. And the way that he writes it is very conversational, like he's just talking to someone, and he's always going back and referencing other recipes, and it can get kind of confusing if you just read one recipe in and of itself. So this is a bit of a mashup of a few of the recipes. Beef with garlic harvester sauce. Prepare the meat like I told you, put parsley roots, leaves, and onions into it. What we call harvest sauce, as I said, is that you beat 6 or 7 eggs in vinegar and start whipping it. Peel the garlic clove by clove, break it well, add it to the eggs and vinegar. Then pour the meat's juices into it. Break it well with the blanching stick after adding the liquid. Be careful to keep it from shrinking. So the real question is, what does he mean by prepare the meat like I told you? Because earlier in the book, he says that he's going to tell you how to cook beef, and then just says, after you wake up, pray to God, wash yourself, then wash your pot. If you want to cook beef, wash your pot thrice, salt it twice or thrice, not more. Really? That's all you're going to give us? Okay. Well, we know he uses a pot and salt, and based on some other things that he mentions, I think this is going to be like a pot roast. He also gives a bit of advice that I think applies to me. If you're an old man and can't stand, sit down on a chair in the kitchen. Gladly. Also, if you want to check out this cookbook yourself, Glenn Gorsuch, who was instrumental in having it translated, has been generous enough to put the entire thing online for free, so I will put a link to that in the description. So for this recipe, what you'll need is a 3.5 to 4 pound or about 1 3/4 kilogram boneless chuck roast, 2 teaspoons of coarse salt, divided, 2 teaspoons of black pepper, 2 teaspoons, ha ha ha. Sorry, I couldn't help myself. 2 tablespoons or 30 milliliters of olive oil. 3 cups or 700 milliliters of water. So it seems that the recipe calls for water, but if you wanted to use beef broth or add in a little bit of wine, you wouldn't be wrong to do so. 2 cups or 300 grams of parsley root or parsnips diced. Parsley root and parsnips look exactly alike, and they taste similar, not exactly, but it is really hard to find parsley root because it's a different type of parsley than we typically grow here, at least in the US, so go with parsnips if you can't find parsley root. A 1/2 cup or 15 grams of torn parsley leaves, and 1 large onion chopped. Then for the sauce, you'll need 6 medium eggs, a 1/2 cup or 120 milliliters of white wine vinegar, a 1/2 teaspoon of black pepper, and 1 small head of garlic, or about 2 tablespoons peeled and crushed. Now it's that last ingredient, the garlic, that inspired me to talk about vampires today, because it used to be a thing to do was to stuff the mouths and other orifices of the dead to stop them from becoming the undead. And before they used garlic, it seems that rocks did the trick. This week I came across their video on vampire skeletons. From Ireland to Romania, there have been skeletons found with evidence of rocks or nails being used to stuff the mouths or weigh down the bodies of the dead so that they can't rise up. And William of Malmesbury tells of the Witch of Berkeley, who was so worried about being brought back to life as one of the undead that when she did die, she made sure that she would have her body wrapped in a stag skin and then put into a stone coffin and wrapped 3 times with chains. But William says it didn't work because the devil just came right into the church, tore the chains asunder, and took her away. Her pitiable cries were heard for nearly the space of 4 miles. If only they'd used garlic. So if you want to keep learning awesome stuff like this, make sure to visit wondrium.com/tastinghistory or visit the link in the description to start your free trial today. Now, I better work on this sauce before the undead start creeping around my condo. So first, wash and dry your roast, then rub it down with 1 of the teaspoons of salt and the pepper. Now often when you buy a roast, it's already trussed, but if it's not, then you'll want to tie some twine around it a couple times just to help it hold its shape. Then heat 2 tablespoons of olive oil in the Dutch oven or a large pot on the stove over medium-high heat. Once the oil is shimmering, set the roast in the pot and brown on all sides, 8 to 10 minutes. Then remove the roast and set it on a plate. Now add the parsley root or parsnips, the parsley leaves, the onion, and the remaining salt to the pot and cook until the onions are nice and tender, about 8 to 10 minutes. Also, if it looks too dry, then go ahead and add a bit more olive oil. Then pour in the water to deglaze the pot, making sure to scrape down any browned bits on the bottom and sides of the pot. Then add the roast back into the pot along with any juice that has come off of it, and make sure that the liquid comes at least halfway up the side of the roast, add a bit more if needed. Then let it come to a simmer. Once it does, cover the pot and set it in the oven at 300 degrees Fahrenheit or 150 Celsius for about 3.5 hours. Now while that cooks, and before we make the Transylvanian garlic harvester sauce, one has to wonder, why do vampires hate garlic so much? Garlics, though used by the French, are better adapted to the uses of medicine than cookery. Now, while Ms. Amelia Simmons, author of one of America's first cookbooks, should have known better than to disparage the culinary uses of garlic, she was right to tout its medicinal uses, because garlic has been used for medicine for millennia. The ancient Egyptian Ebers Papyrus promotes garlic's use in treating and preventing the stings and bites of snakes, scorpions, wasps, and bloodsuckers of all ilks. So it's not a huge leap to think if garlic works on the little bloodsuckers, it'll work on the big bloodsuckers too. In the writings of numerous medical texts of ancient Greece and Rome, garlic seems to treat nearly every malady imaginable, including infections and diseases of the blood. What's more, throughout history and in cultures all over the world, garlic has been used to ward off all manner of evil, which is somewhat ironic seeing as one of the origin stories of garlic's rather sulfurous odor claims that the plant sprung up from the first left footprint that Satan left as he moseyed out of the Garden of Eden. The right footprint gave us onions. Now, when exactly all of these theories about garlic's powers became associated with vampires, we don't exactly know, but it probably happened in southeastern Europe. And the origin of the specific vampiric characteristics of the blood-sucking undead is also unknown, but likely stem from the symptoms of several diseases that ravaged the area for centuries. There's porphyria, which causes the sufferer to have pale skin, light sensitivity, and complaints that the sun causes severe pain, and I'm starting to think that maybe I have porphyria. Though my dentist hasn't said anything, and those suffering from the disease often exhibit a receding of the gums and the lips, leading to a fang-like appearance. And many patients complained of a sensitivity to sulfurous foods like garlic, which I think I'm safe because I friggin' love this stuff. Another disease that ravaged the area and often triggered vampire panic was the plague. And along with herbs, garlic was thought to ward off the disease, so a connection seems inevitable. But for my money, the disease that seems most vampire-like has to be rabies. Both vampires and werewolves likely have origins in this scourge which is spread by biting. The sufferer often froths a bloody foam from the mouth and behaves in an erratic and violent manner. And they develop a heightened sense of smell, making things like garlic all the more repulsive. And the two animals most associated with the disease were dogs, hence werewolves, and bats, vampires. It was a bat that gave Meredith rabies in the office. She did not turn into a vampire though. But if you are worried that you might turn into a vampire after being bitten by a bat, you can just eat a lot of garlic. And if you don't want to eat it, then it seems you could just kind of hang it about the place. For example, even today in Romania, Saint Andrew is revered as the country's patron saint as well as the patron saint of wolves and the man responsible for bringing garlic to the country. And so on November 30th, the feast day of St. Andrew and Romania's version of Halloween, the way to ward off the spirits, demons, and vampires endemic to the holiday was to hang garlic from your windows and doors, hang it in your barn, and even spread it on your livestock. They also have a tradition known as the guarding of the garlic, where the young people of the town would bring garlic to the center of town, put it in a pot, and then dance around it, and then have the matriarch of the village watch over it all night. And while the holiday seems to be when the vampires are most active, the practice of hanging garlic should work all year round. That's actually what Dr. Van Helsing did to protect Lucy in Bram Stoker's Dracula. Though in the book, instead of cloves of garlic, it was actually garlic flowers that he hung about the room and made into a necklace to put around Lucy's neck, to ensure that every whiff of air that might get in would be laden with the garlic smell. Unfortunately for Lucy, nobody seemed to tell her mom of the plan, and so her mother comes in and is like, this place stinks. It smells like garlic in here. Takes all the garlic, throws it out, opens the window to let some fresh air in, which, spoiler alert, also lets Dracula in, who kills Lucy. So Van Helsing fills her coffin with garlic, but no dice, she still rises up, becoming one of the undead, and so they have to stake her through the heart, cut off her head, and for good measure, stuff some more garlic into her mouth. Now, much of the vampire lore that we have around today actually comes from the book Dracula, but much of what Bram Stoker got came from actual practices in Romania that were documented in the 19th century by Emily Gerard in The Land Beyond the Forest, Facts, Figures, and Fancies from Transylvania. In very obstinate cases of vampirism, it is recommended to cut off the head and replace it in the coffin with the mouth filled with garlic. Though it wasn't just vampires that were deterred by garlic, but in bringing in the corn, a few heads of garlic bound up in the first sheaf will keep off witches. Garlic put in the money bag will prevent the witches from getting at it. Pickpocketing witches, the scourge of our times. Now, she details more about the Nosferatu, or the vampires of Transylvania, including letting us know that there are actually two types of vampire. There's the undead vampire, which we know and love, and they're made by being bitten by another vampire. But then there's also the living vampire, whose creation is maybe a little less threatening to our modern sensibilities. The living vampire is generally the illegitimate offspring of two illegitimate persons. Well, land's sakes, somebody must alert the church elders. The book is also instrumental in helping you detect if there is a vampire amongst you, because they are masters of disguise, and the first thing to do is check to see if it's been raining lately. And if not, then killing a frog is sometimes effectual in bringing on rain. But if this also fails in the desired effect, then the evil must evidently be of deeper nature, and is to be attributed to a vampire who must be sought out and destroyed. I'm thinking Los Angeles is filled with vampires because it never rains here. We do have a lot of talent agents, and they're bloodsuckers. Now, I know what you're saying. This is all old superstition, confined to books and movies and TV shows. But allow me to offer a bit more contemporary evidence for the use of garlic against vampires. In the 1970s, Harry Sen, a folklorist, was told that even at that time in Romania, handing out garlic at a church service and seeing who did and did not eat it was a good way to detect if there was a vampire in the congregation. And in 2012, less than a decade ago, garlic sales skyrocketed in a small Serbian town after the town council warned everyone that they should hang garlic from their doors and windows. We have also reminded them to put a holy cross in every room in the house. The precaution was due to the collapse of an old shack that had been the home of the 19th century vampire Sava Savanović. The destruction of the house was thought to leave Sava Savanović homeless, and so he would be wandering about looking for alternative accommodations. Now, did the people actually believe that this was a real threat, or was it all a bit of fun, a little tongue-in-cheek? I don't know. What I do know is that with all of the garlic in the sauce that I am about to make, I should be safe just in case Sava Savanović comes prowling around Burbank. So you'll know your meat is cooked when you can insert a fork or a knife into the meat and twist with very little resistance. Then take the pot out of the oven, carefully removing the roast and letting it rest on a platter. Now to make the sauce, go ahead and whisk the eggs and then whisk in the vinegar until smooth. Then add in the garlic and the pepper and whisk to combine. Then take a cup or so of the broth that the roast was cooked in and very slowly add it into the eggs, whisking vigorously the entire time so that you temper the eggs and they don't curdle, or what the author calls shrinking. Now, it's kind of unclear here what to do next with the sauce, if it's ready now or if you have to heat it, because he warns to not let it boil, and if it's not being heated, then I don't see why that would need a warning. So for my money, put the sauce in the saucepan and set it over low heat to slowly warm while you whisk. This will thicken the sauce over the next couple minutes, just make sure not to let it boil or it will curdle. And here we are, 16th century Transylvanian beef with garlic harvester sauce. It smells so good. You can smell the garlic, most definitely, and then there's a bit of a tang to the vinegar, but the other aromas from the meat and everything, it smells really, really good. Let's give it a shot. The meat is so tender, it just falls apart. It's so good. It's so flavorful, even with just the water. I didn't use broth or wine. You can, but It doesn't need it. It has plenty of flavor, and the garlic sauce, it is strong. You don't need very much, just a little bit on top, and it just lifts it up. It is garlicky. If you don't like garlic, you're not gonna like this sauce. But it is absolutely delicious, and it's a really smooth sauce, which for this time period is odd because they're just coming off of thickening sauces with like breadcrumbs, and so they tend to be kind of lumpy, but this isn't. It's so smooth, it's almost like a modern day sauce. Try a parsnip. Honestly, I was gonna say you could also use just like a turnip. It's a little bit different, but you could also just use a turnip. So of all of the savory dishes, the entrees that I've made here on the channel, I think this might be my favorite ever. It's absolutely wonderful, so I encourage you to make it. I also encourage you to like this video and to click the link in the description for your free trial of Wondrium. Also, for more Halloween content, last year I did an excellent episode, if I do say so myself, on soul cakes and the history of trick-or-treating, so I'll put a link up here, and it should be the next video that pops up if you just keep watching, so I'll see you over there on Tasting History. When the brilliant composer Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart died in December of 1791 at the age of 35, Vienna was awash in rumor. What killed Mozart? Was it a pox, poison, a jealous rival perhaps? Well, to this day, nobody actually knows, but it was likely an illness, and one theory is that it was trichinosis brought on by eating undercooked pork. A dish like this 18th century Austrian recipe for rye and cinnamon-crusted pork loin. So thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring this video as we ask the question, what or who killed Mozart? This time on Tasting History. Today is Mozart's 270th birthday, so since he is one of my favorite composers of all time, I thought it would be fun to do a video dedicated to him. Now at first I was going to actually make the nipples of Venus, which are featured in the movie Amadeus, but as they didn't actually exist in Mozart's time, and I already made them over on Binging with Babish a couple years ago, I figured I would do something a little more historically appropriate. I figured I would find something that he actually wrote about in his letters, which we still have to this day, and that led me to a theory about his death. See, in late 1791, Mozart was in the midst of perhaps his most productive year ever. He had recently premiered 2 operas, The Magic Flute and La Clemenza di Tito. He'd also composed numerous smaller works, including the Clarinet Concerto in A, and was in the midst of working on the now legendary Requiem. All of this while finally earning enough money to get out of debt. He had lived most of his life in debt, at least his adult life, because he lived lavishly. He went out a lot, he drank a lot, and entertained, and he loved gambling, mostly on billiards and cards, and clearly he wasn't very good at it. But things were finally starting to turn around when, in November of 1791, he fell ill. He developed a high fever, severe muscle pain, vomiting, and a swelling of the limbs. As his wife Constanza and her younger sister nursed him at home, Mozart endeavored to complete the Requiem, but on December 5th, 1791, he died, his last work unfinished. Of course, we see this scene in one of the greatest films of all time, a movie that I have seen no less than 30 times, probably more, Amadeus. But while that film is based on Mozart's life, or rather based on a play, which is based on his life, it also takes a lot of dramatic liberties, especially in the relationship between Mozart and Antonio Salieri, who was another composer. The composers were actually on very good terms with each other, it seems, and Salieri was one of the few people who actually attended Mozart's burial. Now, the film makes no real mention of exactly what killed Mozart, other than showing the man exhausted to the point of delirium. But his official cause of death, according to his family doctor, was hitziges Frieselfieber, or severe miliary fever. And that term wasn't really a specific disease, rather it was a catch-all for any illness that caused fever and a rash, mainly because the rash would look like millet, the grain on your skin, hence the name miliary fever. Now, in the past 270 years, at least 136 post-mortem diagnoses have been put forward, including tuberculosis, rheumatic fever, scarlet fever, kidney failure, syphilis, mercury poisoning, a streptococcal infection, and for our purposes, trichinosis from eating undercooked pork. See, on October 7th, 1791, Mozart wrote a letter to his wife, Constanza, telling her about a successful performance of Die Zauberflöte, the magic flute, his opera. And at the end of it, he writes, "What do I see? What do I smell? It is Don Primus with the pork. Que gusto! I eat to your health. It is just striking 11. Perhaps you are already asleep. Shh, shh, shh. I will not wake you. Husband who loves you, W.A. Mozart." 44 days later, he began to show the signs of an illness which could be caused by trichinella, the parasite that causes trichinosis. Now, is it definitive? No. But is it possible? Yes. And so my question is, well, what kind of pork dish would he be eating? Now, it might be something like a simple pork chop or a breaded cutlet of pork, schnitzel, which was very popular in Vienna, but I've already made that here on the channel, so I figured that I would look to an 18th century cookbook to find a different pork recipe, and that would be the Viennese cookbook by Johann Holzmeier, Nützliches Kochbuch, or the Useful Cookbook. The cookbook has numerous recipes for how to prepare meat, and recipe 231 specifies mutton loin, but it also says that it can be used for either venison or pork. It says, "Take from a mutton the loin as large as it can be, and dress it as one does a venison loin. Boil it in water, wine, and vinegar with bay leaves, onion, rosemary, and strips of lemon peel until it is quite tender. When it is cooked, arrange it on a casserole dish and pour melted butter over it. Take grated dark bread, mix it with cinnamon and sugar. Sprinkle this over the loin. Pour more butter over it and put it into the oven so that it becomes nicely brown, turning it once or twice. Make a good broth, pour it underneath, and serve it warm at the table." So for the first part of this recipe, what you'll need is 3 to 4 pounds or 1.5 kilograms of pork loin rubbed with 2 or 3 tablespoons of salt. Then 2 tablespoons of butter or olive oil, 2 quarts or 2 liters of water, 2 cups or a half liter of dry white wine, 2 tablespoons of red or white wine vinegar, 4 bay leaves, 1 onion sliced up, 4 sprigs of rosemary, and the zest of 1 lemon. So first, heat the butter or olive oil in a large pot over high heat, and then set the pork in, searing it for about a minute to get some nice browning. Turn it over and sear it all around, including the ends, and then remove it from the pot and pour in the water. Add the white wine and the vinegar along with the bay leaves, onion slices, and the lemon zest, and then let this start to warm, and once it's steaming, you can add the pork back in and let it come to a gentle boil. Then set the lid on the pot and cook for about 30 minutes or until it has an internal temperature of about 130 Fahrenheit, 55 degrees Celsius. And it will continue to cook even after we take it out of the water and once we put it into the oven, of course. Now, the ideal temperature, at least for safe eating, of pork is 145 degrees Fahrenheit. So if Mozart did die of trichinosis, then that means that his valet, Don Primus, did not fully cook whatever he was serving to Mozart, and so you want to make sure to cook it all the way through. You don't want to pull a Don Primus. Now, as the loin boils, one of the preferred methods of cooking pork in the 18th century, we can go ahead and start our crust. So for that, what you'll need is a half cup or 110 grams of butter, 1/3 cup or 65 grams of sugar, 2 teaspoons of cinnamon, and 1.5 cups or 150 grams of dark rye or wheat breadcrumbs. I used pumpernickel slices, toasted them until they were completely dry, and then grated them to make the crumbs. Though after a few slices, I switched to a blender because it was easier and it worked pretty much just as well. So melt the butter in a saucepan, and then in a large bowl, add the breadcrumbs, the sugar and cinnamon, and whisk it all together. That way everything is ready once the pork has boiled. Once it has boiled, remove it from the pot and pat it dry, and then pour a little of the melted butter in a baking dish and set the pork in. Pour the remaining melted butter over the top and the sides, and then start sprinkling the breadcrumb cinnamon sugar mixture on, making sure that you coat the entire thing. If some breadcrumbs fall to the side, that's fine. Better to have too many than not enough. Once coated, set the dish in the oven at 400 degrees Fahrenheit, 205 Celsius, and bake for 15 to 20 minutes or until it has a nice dry crust on top. Now, the recipe says that you should flip it during the cooking. I tried that, it did not work out very well, so I would just leave it be, and that'll give you more time to listen as I tell you a bit more about the death of Mozart. When I was a little boy, I was obsessed with Mozart. I loved everything about him. He was my favorite composer and still is one of my favorite composers to this day. Of course, I loved his music. I loved listening to it. I loved singing it. I got to be one of the 3 boy sopranos in a production of The Magic Flute when I was like 11 or 12 years old. But I also loved Mozart himself. I just loved reading about all these little snippets about how unbelievably incredible he was, especially as a kid, basically the same age that I was at the time. Like, one of my favorite stories of his childhood was his overwhelming fear of the trumpet. The story actually comes from Johann Schachtner, who was a friend of Mozart's father and who was the court trumpeter in Vienna, or rather in Salzburg at the time. And he wrote, "Until he was almost 9, Mozart was terribly afraid of the trumpet when it was blown alone, without other music. Merely to hold a trumpet in front of him was like a pistol at his heart. Papa wanted me to cure him of this childish fear, and once told me to blow the trumpet at him despite his reluctance. But my God, I should not have been persuaded to do it. Wolfgang scarcely heard the blaring sound when he grew pale and began to collapse, and if I had continued, he would surely have suffered a convulsion." And it's interesting because in his entire life, Mozart is only known to have written 1 concerto for the trumpet, and he did so at 12, which makes me wonder if his father Leopold made him write it to just help him try to get over his fear of the trumpet. Sadly, we don't actually have that trumpet concerto, and the only reason we know it exists is because Leopold mentioned it in his letters. The other story that I really love about Mozart as a kid was when he supposedly defied a papal decree when he was only 14. In 1770, he traveled with his father to the Vatican, and on Ash Wednesday they went to the Sistine Chapel to hear the Miserere by Gregorio Allegri. Now, this is one of the most ethereal and haunting pieces of music that I know of. I absolutely love it. And it also has this mystique around it, or rather it had a mystique around it at the time, because supposedly, ever since it had been composed in the 1630s, it was forbidden to take the music, the written music, out of the Vatican, and it shouldn't be performed anywhere but the Sistine Chapel. And Leopold Mozart wrote about this in a letter to his wife. "You have often heard of the famous Miserere in Rome, which is so greatly prized that the performers in the chapel are forbidden on pain of excommunication to take away a single part of it, to copy it, or to give it to anyone. But we have it already. Wolfgang has written it down. We shall bring it home with us. Moreover, as it is one of the secrets of Rome, we do not wish to let it fall into other hands." Supposedly, Mozart's genius was such that upon just 1 or maybe 2 listenings of the Miserere, he was able to commit it to memory and go home and write it down. And it's 12 minutes long. It is rather repetitive, but still, pretty amazing feat. Now, perhaps he did this, yes, but there's also the idea that this was the only way that it ever got out of the Sistine Chapel, and it's the only way that we are able to listen to it today. But there are also conflicting stories about how it was being performed in London by the 1760s, so not entirely sure. Either way, I love the story. Now, another story about Mozart, which is less likely to be true, is that his true cause of death was poison. But even though there doesn't seem to be a lot of evidence behind it, that doesn't mean that the story didn't spread within weeks of his death. By the end of December, a Berlin newspaper recorded that Mozart is dead. He returned from Prague feeling sickly. It was thought he had contracted dropsy, but he died in Vienna. Because his body swelled up after death, people thought he had been poisoned. Some seem to have believed that it was a rival composer, Antonio Salieri. Now, when those rumors about Salieri began to appear as unclear, but they had been swirling around for quite some time by the time Salieri was an old man, because in 1823, when he fell ill, he told one of his pupils that although this is my last illness, I can assure you on my word of honor that there is no truth in that absurd rumor. You know that I am supposed to have poisoned Mozart. But no, it's malice, pure malice. Tell the world, dear Moscheles, old Salieri, who will soon die, has told you. But as Salieri's illness grew worse and his mind started to go, it does seem that he, forgive the pun, changed his tune, because Ludwig van Beethoven's nephew wrote to Beethoven that Salieri was telling people that he had indeed poisoned Mozart. And Beethoven's secretary, Anton Schindler, wrote that Salieri is again in a very bad way. He has fantasies that he was responsible for Mozart's death and gave poison. This is true, for he wants to confess it. And even newspapers began running stories about Salieri confessing to the murder of Mozart, but it doesn't seem that they actually believed him. They said it was a bit of lunacy, which surely no one but the poor delirious old man believes. Another theory that didn't arise until 1861 claims that it was not Salieri, but rather the Freemasons who poisoned Mozart. The Freemasons are the world's oldest fraternal organization, and especially in the 18th century were rather secretive about aspects of their order, and Mozart was a Freemason. Now, the theory is without any real evidence, but it was postulated that the Freemasons murdered him because he was divulging their secrets inside of the opera The Magic Flute, which is supposedly coded with many Masonic symbols. The poisoning theory was further bolstered because of Mozart's own words, kind of. They were related by Constanza to a friend, Niemesteck, who was the first biographer of Mozart. She says that before he died, he said, "I feel definitely that I don't have much time left. I am sure I have been poisoned. I cannot rid myself of this thought." Now, all of these theories are unlikely to be true, but especially the Salieri poisoning theory gave wonderful fodder to the fiction writers of the time. The Russian poet Alexander Pushkin used the theory in his play Mozart and Salieri, which was then turned into an opera by Rimsky-Korsakov, and of course the idea that Salieri had something to do with the death was further explored in Amadeus. Now, in Amadeus, it is not poison, but rather Salieri secretly commissions Mozart to write the Requiem, and then his plan is once Mozart dies, then he will take credit for writing the Requiem. But that's pure fiction. Except kind of not, because that actually did happen, it just wasn't Salieri. It turns out that someone did commission Mozart to write the Requiem, and he did so in secret. His name was Count Franz von Walsegg. He was an Austrian nobleman and a wannabe composer. And I say wannabe because after trying his hand at it, he kind of realized it was hard to do, and so he would hire other composers to write things and pay them handsomely with the caveat that they could never take credit for it, and then he would take credit for it. Well, in 1791, following Walsegg's wife's death, he commissioned Mozart to write a Requiem, but he did so through a messenger, so Mozart never knew who was actually commissioning it, and the messenger said, "Don't you dare try to find out who my employer is." Well, Mozart was very much in need of the money at the time, so he accepted, but he kept falling behind because he ended up working on other things like the opera La Clemenza di Tito, which was written for the coronation of the new Emperor Leopold. Well, the messenger returns and is questioning Mozart, saying, "Where is my Requiem?" And he says that I'll actually pay you more if you get this done quickly. And so Mozart agrees, but then he falls ill and he ends up telling his wife that he feels like he is writing this Requiem for himself. Well, shortly after his death, the messenger comes to collect the unfinished Requiem, but the cat was already kind of out of the bag because before he died, Mozart had given it to his assistant, Franz Süssemeyer, who was actually the one to finish the Requiem. Once he did give that to the Count, and Walsegg ended up still trying to take credit for it for about a year, and it was only because Mozart's widow, Constanza, was saying things and knew that Mozart had written this that finally he relented and acknowledged that Mozart had actually written the Requiem. Alas, while that mystery was revealed, we will probably never know the mystery of what actually killed Mozart. Was it a fever of some kind, rheumatic fever, or syphilis, or scarlet fever, or something else? Maybe trichinosis? Who knows? What we do know is that on October 7th, 1791, Mozart did eat a meal of pork very much like the one that I am about to enjoy right now. So once the breadcrumbs on the pork have dried into a crust, let it rest for 5 to 10 minutes, then serve it with a bit of the broth that the pork boiled in. And here we are, a cinnamon and breadcrumb encrusted pork loin from Mozart's Vienna. By the way, I got this fork. It is not an actual antique, it's a replica, but I just think it's so cool. It's so pretty. Anyway, here is Got a good amount of the crusting on top, some of the pork. Here we go. That is so good. That's really, really good. I would almost think that it's actually better to cook this like with the crusting all around each piece because the crust is really good. It's a little sweet, but not super sweet. Yeah, cut another piece. A little cinnamon, but not super cinnamon. But it's also got a nice crunch to it. What is evident is that boiling pork is just not the best way to cook pork. It's just not the best way to really cook most meat. It just kind of makes it a little tough. It's not that it's overcooked. It is overcooked, I think, but it's just not the best way to cook meat. Also, I don't know that the boiling liquid added all that much flavor. Maybe it did, all those other things that we put in there. I think really you could just kind of cook it however you want and then have that crusting on the outside, because it is the crusting that's really the star of the show here. Now, something else that's interesting about this meal is that we not only know that Mozart ate it, but we know that when he did so, he had a clean tablecloth, because on October 8th, the day after he ate this, he wrote another letter to his wife Constanza saying, "You should have seen me at supper yesterday. I couldn't find the old tablecloth, so I fished one out as white as a snowdrop and put in front of me the double candlestick with wax candles." Very fancy. Actually, I have a terrible little dad joke for you about Mozart. What did Mozart do after he died? He decomposed. Now I'll see you next time on Tasting History. So here's a predicament I know we've all been in. You're getting ready to host a Victorian-style soiree for all of your closest friends, and it turns out all you have is beer, sugar, and eggs. What do? Well, you make beer punch, of course, and that's what we're making today. We'll also talk about the infamous and quite literal London beer flood of 1814, this time on Drinking History. So there aren't that many beer cocktails around today. There are a few, but not that many, and frankly, I think that's probably for the best. But in his 1896 book, Fancy Drinks and Popular Beverages by the Only William gives us a recipe for beer punch. Boil 1 quart of beer with 1/4 of a pound of lump sugar and a stick of cinnamon. Beat 4 eggs into foam and mix it with a wineglass of old Jamaica rum. Take the beer from the fire and add it to the mixture while continually stirring it. Serve in punch glasses. Sounds kind of weird, but one of the very first episodes of Tasting History was a buttered beer from the 16th century which had butter and eggs in it, so maybe this is like a descendant. Anyway, for this recipe, what you'll need is 1 quart or 1 liter of beer. Now the beer is really up to you. He's very specific in other recipes what beer to use. He's not in this one, so I figure pretty much anything is going to be fine. I'd probably use something like a darker ale, or I'm using a dark porter because that ties into our history today. A heaping half cup, or about 115 grams of sugar. Now I'm using an unrefined raw sugar. You can also use regular sugar. It calls for lump sugar, which is less sweet than a regular granulated sugar, so I think that this is probably the way to go. 1 cinnamon stick, 4 eggs, I've already cracked mine, and 2 ounces of rum. Now he calls for an old Jamaica rum, which was a darker rum like this. This one is actually from Hawaii, but it'll work for this. I wouldn't use, no flavored rums, and probably not a white rum for this either. So first, go ahead and pour your beer into a pot or a saucepan. Then we're going to mix in the sugar using an adorable little Pikachu spatula. And we'll also kind of mix it in. Probably not going to dissolve very well at the beginning, but once it gets heated up, it will. Throw in your cinnamon stick. Should add some good flavor. And then start heating it. We're going to bring it up to a simmer. Calls for a boil, but let's go a light boil, like a simmer. While that heats up, go ahead and whisk your eggs. You want to get them nice and foamy. They're not going to get too big like if they were just egg whites, but they should get nice and foamy. It's just going to take you a while. It'll take a few minutes for them to get foamy, but the beer is going to take even longer to start to simmer. So while I wait for that, let me tell you about this really crazy day in 1814. Our story begins, as so many do, in foggy old London town, on the corner of Tottenham Court Road and Oxford Street in an area then known as St. Giles' Rookery, and frankly, it was not a very nice place. And it hadn't been since the 12th century when Queen Matilda opened St. Giles Hospital there, and it was used as a leper colony for centuries. By the 15th century, they had added gallows for executions, which oddly enough did not help real estate prices, and then in 1606, as if they needed to make it official, Parliament condemned the area as deep, foul, and dangerous. And in 1665, the Great Plague of London broke out in that neighborhood. Really, they just couldn't catch a break. Though there were times when it was a bit of a destination spot, seeing as it was on the route from Newgate Prison to the gallows at Tyburn, and the condemned were often allowed to pop in one last time to an inn called the Angel. The clergy at the church next door would pay for them to have one last drink called a St. Giles Bowl. This was a neighborhood whose inhabitants were described by the writer Henry Mayhew as a noisy and riotous lot, fond of street brawls, and fat, ragged, and saucy, which coincidentally is the name of my exotic dance trio. Let's welcome to the stage, Fat, Ragged, and Saucy. So naturally, this was the neighborhood that Henry Mayhew decided to invest in 1809 when he bought the Horseshoe Brewery. And based on the neighborhood's track record, he could not have been that surprised at what happened just a few years later. See, Mayhew had built a 22-foot-high wooden vat capable of holding 18,000 barrels of porter, and it was held together by several massive 700-pound iron bands. Well, around 4:30 in the afternoon on October 17, 1814, the storehouse clerk, George Crick, saw that one of the bands was slipping, and when he went to his supervisor to tell him about it, the supervisor just said, yeah, that happens sometimes. Go write a letter to one of the partners, they'll handle it when they have the time and money. Unfortunately, an hour later, standing only 30 feet away from the vat, probably with that little letter in his hand, the vat burst. A torrent of porter ripped through the facility, knocking over other vats, releasing an estimated 320,000 gallons of beer. The wave of which knocked down the 25-foot wall at the back of the brewery, sending a 15-foot wave of beer into the streets of London. And the first casualty was when that wall fell on 14-year-old Eleanor Cooper as she was washing pots outside of the Tavistock Arms where she worked. The wave moved on to destroy several houses, in one of which Hannah Banfield, a 4-year-old, and her mother were having tea and swept Hannah into the street, killing her almost instantly. In another house, people were holding an Irish wake for a 2-year-old boy who had just passed away, and the beer came in and killed all of the mourners. As there were no drains in the street, the cellars in the buildings surrounding the street filled up with porter, nearly drowning some and injuring many others, and in total, 8 people died. In the aftermath, the Morning Post said that it was a scene of desolation that presents a most awful and terrific appearance, equal to that which fire or earthquake may be supposed to occasion. Now, the press at the time made no mention of drunken riots or people going out into the streets filling up their cups with beer, but due to an anti-Irish sentiment in the city at the time, and this was a very Irish neighborhood, those stories began to crop up in the following weeks. But there's no reason to think that it actually happened because the fact that it didn't appear in any of the papers, which weren't terribly pro-Irish either. What also didn't happen was any kind of accountability for the brewery itself, as an inquest reached the verdict that it had been an act of God, and the 8 people who had lost their lives had done so casually, accidentally, and by misfortune. Instead of paying restitution to the victims, Parliament decided that Mayhew and Company didn't have to pay excise tax on the beer that they had lost, saving the company from any kind of bankruptcy. Nothing went to the families. It's good to see that some things just never change. One good thing that did come from the incident was that they phased out the use of those big wooden vats, replacing them mostly with concrete vats. Now, oddly enough, this is not the only alcohol flood in history. There are several others that I won't be talking about today, but will definitely be making appearances in future drinking history videos. As for our beer punch, this is starting to simmer, so I'm going to finish up the eggs so we can try this out. Now, once your eggs are nice and frothy, go ahead and add 2 ounces or about 60 milliliters of that rum, and then beat that in. Now, I could probably do this all in this little bowl, but he says to serve it in punch glasses, so I'm going to mix it in this punch bowl very carefully. Take this out. So as you can see, the eggs nice and frothy, and very slowly, stirring the entire time, you're going to add the beer to the eggs. Stirring the entire time, very, very slowly. You don't want scrambled eggs. Just a little bit at a time. If you pour it all in there at once, you're going to end up with little pieces of scrambled egg in your punch, and nobody wants that. A lot of people who made the butter beer, that's what they ended up with, and it's probably because I wasn't terribly specific in those early days with how slowly you had to do it. I can't remember honestly, but go slow. And there we are. That's our beer punch. Let's give it a taste. As I said, he says to serve it in a punch glass. You could use it and put it in like a mug or anything. Just make sure that since it's hot, it's something with a handle. It's so frothy, which I like. Though, I have to say, it's August when I'm recording this, the end of August, and it's like 90 degrees out. Not sure why I chose something hot beer to drink, but I did, so here we go. It's weird. It's good though. It's like, there's a creaminess. It's not an egginess, there's a creaminess to it. You can smell just a hint maybe of the egg, but it's more of the cinnamon. You get more of that cinnamon. Though I think this would be really good with even more spices in it. Add maybe some nutmeg or cardamom, maybe a little bit of clove, or just more cinnamon. Also, I think a big thing with this is what kind of beer you end up using, because that's of course the dominant flavor, that's the main ingredient. So using something like this works, a porter. I think like a chocolate stout or a vanilla flavored darker beer would be really, really nice. I'd probably steer away from something on the lighter side, like don't use a lager or pilsner or anything like that. But anyway, that's our beer punch, and it's perfect for the holidays, which are kind of coming up. So maybe hold off on making this one for a couple months, but eventually I think it's worth it. So make sure to follow me on Instagram, Tasting History with Max Miller, and I will see you next time on Drinking History. Today I am making the national dessert of Egypt, a bread pudding called omali, a dessert with an interesting story of deceit, murder, and the rise and fall of Egypt's only female sultan. So thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring this video as I make omali, this time on Tasting History. So this dish, omali, is said to have received its name in the 13th century, but bread puddings, very much like the modern version, have been in cookbooks from Egypt and the region going back at least to the 10th century, like in the Kitab al-Tabikh, or Book of Cooking by Ibn Sayyar al-Warraq, which says take semolina or white bread and soak it in milk until saturated. Then take half a pound of sugar, or as much as is needed for the amount of bread, crush it and mix it with the bread. Then take a clean and shallow pot, add the soaked bread, milk, and sugar, return the pot to slow burning coals. When the filling is cooked and set, remove the pot from the fire, turn it out onto a wide bowl, and serve, God willing. Other versions from the medieval period include some flavors that you will find in the modern version, like cinnamon and almonds and pistachio and even rose water. But then there are also some ingredients that you don't really find today in this dish, like camphor and chicken. Now I am going to steer clear of the chicken, but I will use some of the other ingredients that I found in some of the medieval recipes. I'm also going to use the bread that was used at the time. Today it's very often made with croissants, which I'm sure is delicious. But back then they used a flat bread that was unleavened called rukak. And to make that, all you do is mix a half teaspoon of salt into 1 pound or 450 grams of flour, and then add 200 milliliters or a little over 3/4 of a cup of water and mix it all into a dough. Once the dough comes together, knead it on the counter for about 15 minutes or until it starts to become smooth, and then wrap it in some plastic wrap and set it aside for an hour to allow the gluten to relax. It'll also give you plenty of time to relax because kneading that dough, that really takes it out of you. Once you and the dough are nice and relaxed though, divide the dough into 8 pieces, then form each into a ball and begin to roll it out. Stretch and roll until it becomes as thin as you can possibly make it. Then set the dough on a pan and put it in the oven at 475 degrees Fahrenheit, 245 Celsius for 5 minutes. Now you can bake this for like 2 minutes and it will be done, but it'll be nice and soft and you can use that for like a wrap or something. But we want to have crispy bread. So you want to wait until it puffs up and begins to get some color on it, then take it out, and if it's nice and crisp, you know it's ready. This bread is still made in Egypt today, though I feel like usually it's used for a stuffed meat pie that they have, but it's used the same way that you would use like phyllo dough or puff pastry. And if you don't want to make it, you can actually just use some phyllo dough or puff pastry. It's going to end up being very similar, especially because after you've done all of the work of making it, you're just going to crumble it up into a baking dish. So sad. Like I said, the modern version just uses croissants, and so you can just like dry some croissants and break those up. That'll work too, but if you are doing that, then skip this next part because croissants have a lot of butter in them, whereas most of the old historic recipes say to melt beef tallow or butter and put that over the bread. I opted for butter. I used a half cup or 120 milliliters. Along with the melted butter, you can top this with an assortment of different nuts or dried fruits. Many of the old recipes have just all sorts of variations. I am using 3/4 of a cup of almonds, 3/4 of a cup of pistachios, and 1 cup of sultanas. Sultana is actually the word for a female sultan, or more often the person who is married to the sultan, so it's pretty fitting for this dish. Also, the nuts are going to be best if you toast them for a little while in a dry pan and then break them up before scattering them across the top and then add that layer of sultanas. Now when it comes to the milk that you use, most of the modern recipes use condensed milk, but they didn't have condensed milk in 13th century Egypt. So I looked toward some of the older recipes and they would use things like sour milk, some used yogurt, and then some just used basic milk and cream. So I am using 1 quart or 1 liter of whole milk plus 2 cups of cream to help thicken it. To that, whisk in 3/4 of a cup or 150 grams of sugar, and then set the pot on the stove and let it heat up. Once it starts to simmer, remove it from the heat and let it cool for about 5 minutes. And this is where you can add in all of the different flavors that you want to. Some of the old recipes used musk or poppy seeds or camphor, lots and lots of different things. I opted for 3/4 of a teaspoon of cinnamon, 3/4 of a teaspoon of cardamom, and 1 teaspoon of rose water. Whisk those into the warm milk and then gently pour the milk over the bread and nuts. Make sure all of the bread gets nice and soaked, and you can push some of the nuts down and the sultanas down as you do this. Then set the dish in the oven at 400 degrees Fahrenheit, 205 Celsius, and let it bake for about 25 minutes or until the top gets nice and brown and the milk starts to bubble. So I had not heard of this dish until about a month ago when a viewer emailed me telling me a little bit about this dish. And on that same exact day, I went to go see a show, and at intermission, somebody came up to me and was like, "Hey, you should make amali." And then he proceeded to tell me the story about this dish. It's just kind of weird how that happens. Never heard of it, twice in one day. Anyway, the story was filled with intrigue and deceit and murder, and was amazing, and just the kind of thing I like to talk about here on Tasting History. So now I am going to tell you the story of amali. The year is 1239, and a young girl named Shajar al-Dur has found herself enslaved. And just like so many enslaved people at the time, at least women, she was to be sold as a concubine. And the man who bought her was the Prince of Egypt, Al-Salih Ayyub. Well, what happens next? Prince buys concubine, prince becomes sultan, sultan falls in love with concubine, sultan frees concubine, sultan and concubine get married. It's a tale as old as time. Well, while this twisted little love story is playing out in Egypt, further to the north, in France, King Louis IX is fuming. He has just learned that the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem has been captured and is now in the hands of that same concubine-marrying sultan. So he decides to start a crusade because, it's the Middle Ages and that's what you do. This is going to be the 7th crusade, and just like so many movie franchises, once the 7th one comes along, people start to lose interest. They're getting distracted by things like holy wars in Italy and the new Mongol franchise, which is coming in and invading Hungary. So people just weren't really into going on crusade at the time, so Louis decides, fine, I'll do it by myself. So he gathers his almost entirely French army and heads not to Jerusalem, but straight for Egypt. Well, that is a surprise, especially to the Egyptian Sultan, who happens to be in Syria at the moment fighting someone else. So he hears that Egypt is being invaded, and so he heads back. He gathers all of his generals, say, hey, we need to get an army. We're going to set up camp here at Mansoura, and then he dies. He just dies. He had an abscess on his leg. They amputate it, and a few days later at night, he's dead. And the only person who was with him when it happened was his wife, Shajar al-Dur. The woman had to think on her feet. Now, the Sultan did have a son from a previous relationship, a man named Turan Shah, but unfortunately they did not get along well together, the Sultan and his son, and so he had never officially made him his heir. Plus, he had sent him to live way, way far away in what is now modern-day Turkey, so even if he had been the heir, he wasn't around to help. And by now, the French army had taken control of many of the port cities on the Nile Delta and was moving in to Egypt. And if people find out that the Sultan is dead, it's going to be absolute chaos. The generals are going to start fighting for power and the government is going to collapse. So what is Shajar to do? Well, have you seen Weekend at Bernie's? Because basically, that was her plan. She just pretended like he hadn't died. She told a few people who she really trusted what was going on, but most people were none the wiser, and she maybe forged his signature on a stack of documents, so whenever he was going to give an order, she would write it down and hand it off to a general or whoever. So she was kind of in charge. Now, one of the things that she did do was send somebody to go get that estranged son and bring him back, which he finally did. But as he was coming back, people started to figure out that something was afoot. Maybe the Sultan was, dead or something. And so Shajar finally comes out and is like, yeah, he died last night. It just happened. He hasn't been dead for weeks. It just happened. Not long after this, Turan Shah, the son, finally arrives in Egypt, and he, according to the sources, gathers an army of 3,000 farmers and fights the Crusader army of 15,000 strong and defeats them, capturing the entire force, including King Louis himself. End of 7th Crusade, roll credits. Everything's great now. Egypt is happy. They got their new sultan, except that it turns out the new sultan is a belligerent psychopath who is bent on killing all the people that his father brought into power. Now, this is, of course, coming from later sources who didn't like him, so who knows exactly what the truth is, but it does seem that he wanted to get rid of the group of people called the Mamluks. These were people who had started out as enslaved mercenaries, but had come to kind of run the place. He wanted to get rid of them and put all of his friends in power. His big mistake, though, seems to be that he also wanted to get rid of Shajar. But Shajar was like, I don't think so. I did not come all this way just to have it ruined by some snot-nosed little brat, even if he is my stepson. So she plotted with the generals to kill him, which they did. They hacked Turan Shah to death in the Nile River. Also, I love how medieval art makes everyone dress as if they are in Europe. Like, this is Turan Shah of Egypt, who is basically just a tan version of the French King Louis. Anyway, with Turan Shah out of the way, the Mamluks decide that they are going to make Shajar al-Dur sultan in her own right. Now, this is kind of a big deal. This is 13th century Egypt, and they have just made a woman in charge of absolutely everything. Kind of a big deal, and I feel like more people should know about this, especially because she did a really good job. Within days of taking the throne, she negotiated the ransom of King Louis and the French army for an enormous sum of money and got them to retreat from the port cities that they'd taken in the Nile Delta. Well, everybody should be happy, right? Not exactly, because there is a group in Syria called the Ayyubids who were kind of in charge of Egypt for the last 100 years. Her husband was one of them, and so they're like, wait, you put her on the throne? That's not cool. And so they start revolting. But even worse, the Caliph of Baghdad, who was the de facto religious leader of the caliphate, says, no, I don't think a woman should be in charge. So even though it was absolutely not fair, Shajar decides, fine, I will marry one of my top generals, a man named Az-ul-Din Aybak. Well, Aybak already has a son and a wife, and Shajar says, okay, that's fine, as long as they stay away. Which they did for a while. We'll get back to them. But at first, things go all right. Aybak is basically in charge of the militaries, and Shajar is in charge of running everything else in Egypt. Hunky-dory, until finally Aybak is like, you know what? I should be in charge of everything. And so they had some spats and things started to fall apart. In addition, some military issues have arisen up in Syria, most of which Aybak actually caused. But Aybak needed some help dealing with it, so he needed an ally in the region. And that ally would be the Emir of Mosul. And to cement this relationship, Aybak says, okay, I'll marry your daughter, even though he's already married to Shajar. But whatever. Except that when Shajar finds this out, she's like, I don't think so. I did not come all this way to have some hussy from Mosul come in and take my power. So she decides, how about I deal with this in the same way that I dealt with the last sultan who made me mad? So one night, while Aybak is taking a bath, she has her servants go in and stab him to death. And the next morning, she goes out and tells everyone, oh no, my husband of 7 years, who was in perfect health, died last night. But they weren't buying it this time. Well, those who were loyal to the Sultan Aybak decide to torture the servants into confessing the murder, and so they arrest Shajar and lock her up in a tower. And at this same time, Aybak's former wife, the first wife, and son, who had been kind of cast off, came back. The son, who was 15 now, was named Al-Mansur Ali, and he became the new sultan. And his mother, who was still kind of peeved that she had been cast off in the first place, decided that Shajar was maybe too dangerous to keep around. So she had her servants go up into the tower one night, beat her to death with their shoes, and then throw her off the tower. And that was the end of the one and only female sultan in Egyptian history. Really, really quite sad, especially because she was pretty awesome. But after this heinous act, the mother of Ali, the new sultan, decided that they would celebrate with a dessert. And the dessert was a bread pudding, and so everyone called it Ali's mother, because that's who was having it made for the celebration. Ali's mother in Arabic is Ali. So that is where the name of this dish supposedly comes from. And now it's time for me to try my own Ali. So once the milk is boiling and the top is browned, take the Ali out of the oven and serve. And here we are. Ali, the national dessert of Egypt. It smells so good. Today, this is usually served with like a really thick cream that's almost like whipped cream on top, but I am not doing that, so I'm just eating alone, trying to get everything tried on. Here we go. The flavors are so good. It's sweet, but not overly sweet. You get a lot of sweetness from like the sultanas and everything. Flavor is great. The texture is odd because that bread is basically just flour and water. They're almost like noodles. It's kind of like a noodle dessert, which is a thing. But I think that if you use the modern day croissants, it's gonna have a much better texture. This isn't bad, it's just different, and I think that just croissants would be better. But the flavors are great. So especially if you are not making the bread yourself, it's actually a really easy dish to make. It doesn't take that much work. And I will put the recipe for this, as always, on the tasting history.